Well, everybody, I'm really thrilled today because today I get to chat with one of the fabulous local growers that I buy flowers from every week. Welcome, Erica, to the Flower Podcast.
Hi, Scott. Thank you for having me. I feel like
Well,
we've known each other for a long time now.
no, we go way back, way back. Well, I'll never forget the first time you brought flowers into where we are. And I was like, I knew instantly that this person knew what she was doing and had a great eye. And so I have learned lots from you, and I have been thrilled to have you. Now, since I've moved to the north side of Nashville, I'm closer, and I'm excited about that too. But I feel like you have a lot of great insights. And so we'll get into all of that because I know everyone's going to want to hear. Dahlias, the one thing I love about having this conversation now is everybody's in the thick of dahlia season. Everybody is that's growing them is waiting or pinching or doing whatever, and so we're going to talk about all that. But we got to start at the beginning. So got to find out, how did you find your way into the world of flowers?
Um, yeah, it's a long and winding story. Because I didn't grow up in an ag family. And I didn't help at home with like yard work or the garden. I was a bookworm. And anyway, after I got married, we bought our first house. There were roses. I learned how to take care of those. I read everything and I was like, oh, this is so nice. I have like a pretty front yard. And then we moved to London for 7 years, and I took horticulture classes, plant and planting, and a degree course in landscape design, and quickly learned that I enjoyed growing things, not necessarily doing the planning because my math skills are pretty horrendous. Um, so when we came back to the States, I went back to teaching, but like continued to grow. And basically people started asking me for flowers, and I had a huge landscape garden. And yeah, I put together bouquets, and then thought
Where was
about the
this?
fact this was it. Well, that started happening when we moved to Pennsylvania. So like we've
Okay.
moved around quite a bit, and so everywhere that we moved, I created I landscaped the house. I've never seen any of them come to maturity because we've moved so often, which is a little painful, I have
Yeah.
to say. A lot of money in David Austin roses all over the country. You're welcome for
Thanks to
that if
you.
you are living in a house that you purchased from my husband and me. Um, yeah, so it was the people asking me, and then I was like, people like would pay me money, pay me money for flowers, and I was like, oh, it'll fund my hobby. And I started following Erin Benzakein from
Sure.
Flowers when my sister-in-law introduced me to Instagram, and I was like, oh my God, what are those things she's growing? Because prior to that, I hadn't heard of dahlias. It was that one picture with that truck full, that little
Oh my
white truck they
gosh.
have with the
We all
and I
know
was
it.
like, that's what I'm gonna grow. And I ordered from Swan Island that year, had a disaster of a bed that was like 9 feet wide, and I didn't know what I was doing. But I have to say, like, the experimentation in a small setting and figuring out like ha- the growth habit, and bloom production, and learning about spacing and all of those basic things. Like I needed a handle on that, I think, before I even thought about transitioning into growing for seriously for cut flower sales. So I spent a couple of years like figuring out how to grow them. And then Erin announced the Floret course. So I was in that first class,
Oh, I didn't
that
know
online.
that.
Yep. I was in the first class, and I still keep in touch with some of my classmates who are still out there. Some are still gardening, or some are still growing, some are not because of life changes and whatnot. But we keep in touch, which is really it's really nice. I made lifelong friends through it. But through her course, I learned how to grow in a small space because our space in PA was not big. I learned about like intensive growing methods and flipping beds and like always utilizing and maximizing the space that I had. And that translated into dahlias. So after I had figured out how to grow them as a hobbyist, then I started growing them for cut flower sales, small at first. I mean, I had 5 rows that were 30 feet long, and I was like, this is a big time. Look at me go. And they were 4 feet wide, and it was great for a start. And then over the course of the years that we were in PA, I refined and refined and refined to develop a system that worked for me for ease of harvest. And as I did that, then I just was able to expand my field in a way that allowed me to basically maintain it myself. So yeah, I mean, so that's how I got into I just like that was A to Z in like 3 minutes, but that's how I got into like the dahlia sales, because it is truly like, if I didn't grow anything else, I would grow dahlias. It is the one flower that I love more than any other flower for a variety of reasons. They're not the easiest to grow. And like I said, you have to kind of figure it out first, I think, before you scale up. Otherwise,
It's expensive.
everybody makes the same mistakes when they start. But because of the variety of forms and colors and just the output of this particular flower, it was always exciting for me, it's always exciting to go outside and see what's blooming or how quickly something is reblooming, and I like taking care of them. So it's not for everybody. They are divas. But the truth is I like growing lots of other things too. I do, but dahlias are like my passion. And so I think I have figured it out. There have been bumps along the way because of the move and weather and whatnot, but I'm still figuring it out.
Well,
I'm
I
good.
think
I'd like to be great. I'm good, but I'd like to be great.
well, I think you're great, but I will say, so you were in when you were in Pennsylvania, how many different things roughly did you grow up there? Because I know down here you're
um
growing quite a bit.
yeah, it's a lot more. We had an odd shaped property, so I would tuck things into different places. So like we had a small front yard, and that was where the peonies were, and there was a shrub or a hedge, an overgrown hedge, because we were right on the road. And then I had a 30 by 32, wasn't 30, 32 by 70 field that was just for annuals. And that was very good practice for me for coming to a larger farm. And then everything else was dahlias until I discovered hydrangea. And then they went around the fence line. And then I had a little area that had to still be tucked in because it was a little bit damp and shady. And then I found some places to put. So things just started to get tucked in. And every year my husband was like, no more space. That's it. And then like the property was terraced. So like then I moved up into the second terrace, and he's like, see. So yeah, then it grew, and then there was a lot of woods behind us. We weren't clearing it. And so that was the extent of how much I was going to be able to fit into that property. But at the same time, I was able to produce a lot of flowers in that small space. It was probably 3/4 of an acre.
Yeah, well, I
Um,
know. Oh, it was so funny because last summer I was at the ASCFG conference, and I can't remember the co-op name or the person. I'm so feel bad.
Cassie,
Who?
yeah, it's Cassie from
Yes.
Tiki. Hmm.
Yes. So I know she was thrilled that you and I were able to connect, and that she missed you being up there because I think they really loved your product, and well, I know they did. And they
Well,
miss it.
I was very lucky to have met Cassie through Instagram. I just searched, kind of like local flower or Philly flower growers, Philly cut flowers, and she popped up and I reached out to her and I went down in the winter and we seeded snapdragons together. And that's how we met. And I was like so nervous going to meet her because she, you know, she was running a wholesale operation and she was young and like young, a lot younger than me. And she was just doing this really cool urban thing. And I was like, maybe, you know, maybe she'll buy my flowers. And she did. And every year the our sales grew and her wholesale operation got bigger. She was phenomenal. She taught me, I owe her a lot. She taught me so much about, you know, how to sell wholesale. You always put yourself in the shoes of the person who's buying the flowers from you. What do they expect to see? And then, you know, what do they expect to receive? And then at the same time, you do the best you can in the time that you have. And we were all running on fumes by the end of the season because things just got so busy. But she was a huge support, a huge cheerleader. She loved locally grown. She developed such great relationships. So like for me, she was definitely a mentor and a role model for me in terms of like how do I want to be in this business? I want to be like this. And totally professional.
Sure. Well, I know that we've had a couple guests on over the years that have moved like from, one county to the next or down the road or got some land, not just moved from Philadelphia to the middle of northern Tennessee.
Yeah.
And that's kind of a big change. I mean, I know I've been to Philadelphia a couple times. The climate's a little different than it is here, maybe, but so what was that like? I mean, moving your entire world, starting
Um,
over again, I guess.
yeah, starting over. So there's a huge fear in starting over, and then there's huge excitement in starting over, and the two were very much like at war. Um, I had I had a successful little business in Philly, and I was like the fear of leaving that and having to start over and not knowing whether or not I was going to like I was going to be able to find customers, like that's a fear.
Sure.
You know, what dealing with like um just a lot of unknowns about like the temperature and the soil and weather patterns and um sun intensity. Like the lay of the land is a lot different here and the environmental factors are different. And you know, I had the growing part under control, but those environmental factors really can affect what I'm growing. And so there's that adjustment period. I came down and I was like, I'm going to be the biggest dahlia grower Nashville has ever seen. And that's still my goal. You know, it's still my goal. We're getting a little bigger each year and I'm working on developing more of a focus, but so the unknown, the fear, and then the excitement of saying I have all this space. How am I going to utilize that to have a very tidy, well organized farm that makes it easy for me to grow and harvest and sell. So like that part was exciting, the planning, because I did have so much space to utilize.
Yeah, because
But
you
then
have a much bigger property here.
yeah, yeah. So there are 4 acres that are plantable. Some of the planting area need. I mean, I cover crop, so I'm working on some of those areas that were much poorer in soil health than others, and we have a little bit of a water issue in some sections, but I know where they are. So those will eventually be dealt with in terms of we'll probably have to truck in some topsoil to build it up a bit to just level it so that the water isn't sitting in these pockets.
Right.
Um, but it's, I know that that's coming in the next couple of years, but I'm not worried about it right now because I'm just cover cropping. Um, so
Well, the one thing I
okay.
want to say real quick is, you made the comment about, the soil. And to me, you know the weather's going to be possibly different. You know the time of year, the sun, all like even pests. You know you're going to probably have new pests. But it's to me, it's kind of like when it comes to soil, it is such it's like Russian roulette sometimes. And I know one thing when I moved here, I was shocked at the number of, and I guess it's just because I moved from middle Georgia, but I was shocked at the number of rocks. I mean, just rocks everywhere in the soil. And not
Yeah, they're
little
soft
rocks.
though. They're softer, so they break easily. Yeah, a lot more than the rocks in PA were always like flat and skinny. So like digging was a pain because your shovel would get stuck and then you try to go. We actually switched to digging with forks in PA, but here they're like round little boulders. Um, but the main difference is it's like clay. It's very sticky, and when it dries out, it's like concrete.
Yeah.
And our soil in PA was much better, even like with the rock situation, it was much better in PA than it was here. So, it's something I think anybody who grows in Tennessee, well, in this area, has to make a conscious effort to work on improving the tilth of the soil, to make growing things like dahlias possible, because sticking them in this clay was not something that I was going to do anytime.
Well, it's a
So
lot of money just to have them sit there, and then if you end up with a lot of rain, you don't have good drainage, and you just
they
really,
just rot.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So, so moving, it was such a huge thing. But having a clean slate is kind of a fun thing, like you said. And you knew you were going to grow dahlias. How did you decide what else you wanted to grow once you got down here? Just
So because I
tried and
had,
true?
yeah, I mean, because I had, I guess it was 4 years with Cassie. Like we talked all the time, all the growers that sold through the whole through her into the wholesale market in Philly. We talked all the time about like, crops, new crops, what's working, what's not working. But I was very focused on events and weddings. Like that was, I just felt like I was, when I was growing to be a part of those in like a little tiny small way. It always made me really happy to
Mm,
see where the flowers ended up. And so with that in mind, I follow a lot of designers. And so I'm always looking at what's in the bouquets and what's in the floral work and what can I grow that would fit within those designs that designers would want to include in their work. And so I have a very specific color palette, as you know, like
yeah.
there are very specific colors that I grow, and I avoid others like the plague. But that's just because I am trying to figure out like what are those colors and what are those palettes, and then sticking within those palettes for design work, like true design work. And there's some, I've been really pleased here to see where where the flowers have ended up in the design work, and seeing it's like it's beautiful work, it's elevated, it's sophisticated, and it makes me happy to be like a little part of that, even if they don't know who I am. So
Oh, I think a lot of people know who you are. Well, and I know what you mean because I feel that way too. And that was the one when I moved to Nashville, I saw a glimpse of that, and I'm like, okay, I can be a part of this here. And so I kind of really identify with what you just said because I was really nervous because when you go to a town you don't know, you're kind of like, okay, where am I going to fit in? But one of the things I have appreciated about your palette is, a lot of times growers want to grow everything and every color and all this stuff, but you definitely have narrowed your focus to wedding and event palettes.
yeah.
And so I know there was a couple, I'll never forget this, and we're going to talk more about growing and some details. but I think you and I had this conversation. I don't know if you, I'm sure you remember, but you asked me about yellow dahlias, or I
I
think what
love
I
yellow
said.
dahlias.
I
I've been on the
know.
hunt for the perfect yellow dahlia since I had started growing, like, what, I don't know, 10 years ago. Like yellow, I'm obsessed with yellow. I am.
So, well, it was so funny because I think I said I love all of them but yellow, and then you're like, and I can see you cringe. And this was last year, and I can see you cringe, and you're like, well, let's just see. And are like, okay, well, maybe you're going to make a believer out of me, which you did. You successfully did because you were growing shades that I had never seen. And I know that if you're a farmer out there and you grow, you probably already know that there's a lot of dahlias that are sort of what I call that highlighter yellow color,
Kevin
which
Floodlight.
yeah, which kind of fights with every color palette, whether you're going for bright summer or wedding. It fights with everything. So that's what my fear was, and that's what I thought when you said that. And but of course, I don't know how many yellows you grow, but they're all fabulous, and I can't wait. In fact, we had one the other day that I thought, oh my gosh, this is so wonderful.
I
Um,
think that one was Ferncliff Spice. That's new to me this
yeah,
year. It seems like it's going to be a decent producer too, so it'll probably get into the rotation. Yeah, so I have some personal favorites, but I'm like, I'm probably good on yellow, and then I see a new yellow, and I'm like, I need that yellow. Which is probably weird because it's not like everybody's go-to color, but I don't know, it was a personal mission on my part to like make people love yellow,
well,
you know. I don't know. It's like
well,
red. I love red too. I love red, but it's not a color that I grow a lot of. I have some red dahlias that I love, but I don't know that I grow anything else that's red because um, it's one of those colors that's really difficult to work with, I
right.
think, and associated with Valentine's Day and Christmas, holidays. And so I still haven't
Yeah.
wrote it.
Well, I think it's I mean red is one of those colors that there aren't as many flowers that are red that are locally grown, I think, but I will say that we probably, like we'll get some requests for burgundies obviously, but when it comes to that bright fire engine red, no, it's not. I mean, you get some requests, but it's not nearly that many. Well, one of
Well,
the things, yeah, go
go
ahead.
ahead. I'm sorry. There's Cornell red, which is more of a raspberry color to me.
Yeah.
It's not a true red. So I grow that. But my favorite red is Tahoma red velvet because it's this big flower and it's like a deeper red and it's not that fire engine color and it's absolutely beautiful. But again, like, why would I grow more than 50 plants of it? Because there's not going to be a big rush on red in August, I don't
Right.
think, anyway.
No,
Although it looks good with sunflowers, so.
true. Well, I okay, so you just touched on a couple things I want to make sure we get to. So I want to try to stay focused here for a second. I I know that we had an episode that we released earlier in the spring with Christine from Santa Cruz Dahlias that
Okay, I like total like fangirl moment. Love her. Love the fact that she is so open with everything that she's, well, probably 90% of what she's doing. She's a teacher at heart. She really is, because you can go to YouTube, you can follow her on Instagram. She's got books out that everything's affordable. All the stuff on Instagram and YouTube is free. Like, if you wanted to be like a great girl, all you have to do is
tune in.
watch all her videos, read her books, and follow her on Instagram.
Yeah.
She's like a guru.
Yeah, she and her husband, they're just so sweet. I but I we covered some things, but I wanted to cover a few things differently. Number one, because you are a new grower on this property. So you've only really this is your second season on this particular property, it was interesting watching you navigate some of the obstacles that you had.
Yeah.
And I want to talk about that because I feel like, everyone that starts new, I mean, I'll never forget the year I planted, a good patch, not anything huge, but a good patch. And we had flooding and we had all, we had some really bad, situations, and we lost everything because they all rotted. So, and we didn't plant there again, thankfully. But like for you, what were some of the challenges coming into this new property for dahlias specifically? Because I mean, I don't know, you probably grow what, another 30 items, that maybe more than that, maybe 40 items now. I'm not sure, but
Yeah, probably about four. I haven't counted them, but probably about 40 because of the shrub, the woodies
sure.
and perennials. But so um, growing here is different than growing in the north for sure. So the challenges, the ones that I think I was unprepared for some of them. In my mind, I knew I wanted to come here. I knew I wanted to grow dahlias. I knew I wanted to be larger scale. I'm probably a mid-size grower in comparison to like Five Forks or Clara Joyce or some of the bigger farms that are out there. Summer Dreams Farm. I mean,
Right.
hundreds of thousands of dahlias, but I was not prepared for the heat and the sun intensity. That was a huge adjustment. That was caused quite a bit of panic on my part because I had planted the field and like heavily invested in getting that prepped and ready. And it was the sun. Last year we were in drought at this time. We had, there were those days in June where we had like 14 days that was almost 100 degrees every day.
Right. Right.
Yeah, it was. So that was my welcome here. And so yeah, and our irrigation wasn't hooked up yet. So the the water needs are much greater here for dahlias. The sun intensity the intensity of the sun is much harder on the plants here than it was 1,300 miles north. There are insects here that I didn't really have to deal with. One that like really took out about 3 of my main varieties last year, and I didn't realize what was going on until it was like, not that it was too late, because the plants after I realized and mitigated the issue regrew, but it was at that point like the regrowth was much weaker and whatnot. So like there were a lot of unanticipated obstacles, because in my mind I still was like, I'm gonna grow all the dahlias, and it's
Right.
6B. PA was 6B, here is 7B. Like, what's one zone? Really? Come on, guys. Like, what's one zone? I got this. And that was a little bit of my ego getting in the way of me really thinking it through probably a little better than I did. I was just excited and wanted to get started,
Well, of
but
course.
we ended up starting to like put things in place in order to mitigate those environmental circumstances, and then to be able, I talked to so many people about the insect pressures that were here that were different, and some of them that are like really specific to this area, that a lot of people don't deal with. The UT extension, and the entomology department. And I have a friend who works for University of Kentucky, and she was able to talk to their entomologists, and in talking to companies that provided biological controls as well as chemical controls to decide like, how are we going to deal with this? And
So what were those couple insects?
so one was European corn borer,
Mm.
which is a moth. And a shout out to Drew at Clara Joyce, because I had seen on his stories that he was treating for this particular pest and had described it. And then when I realized what was going on, I was like, that's the same thing. And so I reached out to him and we had a long conversation. So he was super helpful. He is a smart guy, and he's just a baby. I mean, he's young. He's young. I could be his mom. I'm that old, but like he's a youngster, and he is really really smart. And was able to like get me started on the path to being able to put preventative measures in place to control it. But this moth flies in lays its eggs, and then they bore into the stem, and then they eat their way down, and basically the stems collapse. And you don't I saw the moths and I'm like, oh look, I'm doing such a good job. I'm attracting all of these pollinators, and like we're so eco-friendly. And meanwhile they were like destroying my crop. So they are not destroying my crop this year. Um hate
Yay.
to be those moths. But part of that is like it's integrated pest management. I mean, I use a variety of controls, a variety of methods in order to reduce the numbers, and then spraying for them, because I can't lose a crop like that. It's how I make my living. So the other one was wireworm, which I have posted
Mm,
about on Instagram, which is, you don't know that until you dig your tubers, which was a really nasty surprise for me.
okay. I remember that now because,
Yeah.
yeah.
So for any listeners who are considering growing dahlias, if you're turning over turf, or if you're turning over field that was pasture, there is a very high chance that you are going to have problems with wireworm, and it's click beetle. These little black, like two segmented beetles, and it's their offspring, and they can live in the soil for like 7 years.
What?
But yeah. So no-till is not the way to go with this, because tilling and disturbing the soil is one way that you disrupt that life cycle and you can get rid of them. So I have been practicing tilling. Um, and then there are different biological controls that you can use. Sound horticulture helped me with that. And so there's a fungus, and then there are nematodes. Mustard cover crop can be
Oh,
grown
really?
and tilled in when it's in flower as like a fumigant. They don't like that. And there are chemicals that you can use as well in the soil. I try to not do that. But I haven't seen any evidence, and I dig holes here and there in the dahlia rows just to check, and I stick potatoes in on like spears, and I pull them out to see if there's any damage to those, and I haven't seen any evidence of it yet. But turning over turf, you are likely going to have them, so it's just something to keep in mind.
Okay. So you said that's called wireworm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm curious when you were talking about the intensity. I know what you did, but people who don't follow you might not know the extreme measures you had to go to. But it was so funny because I want to say, um, I I'm surprised more people don't do what you did, which I know it's not cheap. But would you share a little bit about
Yeah.
what you did?
So I had talked to you about sun intensity, I think, early on, and you had shared what some of the growers in South America were doing to
Hmm.
mitigate or to help protect the plants from the sun intensity. And so when I realized like the plants were really suffering, and that was June, and I was like, they are not gonna, I'm not I'm not getting any flowers out of this crop until maybe mid-September if I don't do something. Um, we put up shade structures, so that was really like that was a very fast decision. We had had a high tunnel installed,
Hmm.
and I was trying to figure out like what is the best way to protect them. I knew I needed to get overhead shade on in order to grow a crop that I could sell to florists that would be florist grade. I had to um, get all of them covered. And I think last year, I don't remember how many I had in the ground last year.
I want to
It's
say it
a
was like 4,000 or just under 4,000 roughly.
Yeah, I mean, it was a pretty big area, and I was like, I don't know what to do. So I looked at the hoop house after considering a lot of options. I looked at the hoop house, and I'm like, why can't it be like that? But not as expensive. So I worked with the same company that put up our hoop, and modified the structure because it only needed to support shade cloth. And then basically begged them to come and install them because I literally was afraid I was going to lose the whole crop. So they came last year, July 5th. It was the day after 4th of July. It was like 102 degrees.
I
And
remember I was in Vegas when that happened because I saw them going, photographs of them going up, and I was just like, wow,
yeah,
wow.
I mean, I supplied them well with, Gatorade water, ice pops, like whatever I could bring out to help cool them down. But I mean, it was hot, and that metal, oh,
Just cooks.
it was a hot day. But the difference before and after was remarkable. Plants that so basically what was happening is the plants were completely wilting during the day, and then they were spending all night like trying to recover from that heat, and the tips of the new leaves were burning, and so I knew that it was heat, it was sun damage. So the day after the shade structures went out and I went up, I went out and to check, and like everything was the way that the way that it should have been. Everything was hydrated, everything was turgid, and the plants looked a lot happier. And within like 2 weeks, there, the damaged growth was gone, and everything was happy and growing healthily. So I knew that I made the right decision. My pocketbook said otherwise, but I mean, they're permanent structures, so they're not going anywhere, and I'll continue to use them. So the shade is really important in the south. If you're growing in the south and you want a crop from when I want it, from July through October, I think for quality crop, they have to be in shade in the afternoon or under some sort of shade structure, whatever that might look like. So providing shade definitely, like it definitely helped them.
Well, it seems so
So
counterintuitive when you have a flower who likes full sun, but they don't like the heat. And so I'm curious, what percentage shade cloth was it?
So I talked to a few people who like Warren Vigor in Australia has shade cloth, and Garden Bee Flower Farm, I think she extended. Who did I talk to? I can't remember who I talked to that had shade, was experimenting with shade. Christine might have had a shade structure up at that point, and they had 30% shade on it. And then I talked to somebody who grew tomatoes, and they had 50, which was on their high tunnel. And I was like, well, when I then talked to greenhouse specialists and said, this is the situation I'm in, and they were like, don't bother putting up 30, you'll regret not putting 50 on. And so we went with 50, which I was worried about. I thought it might be too much. But there's about a 9-degree temperature difference underneath it, and the sun
Wow.
intensity is a lot less. Like you can't feel your skin. Like if you're out, you can feel your skin burning, but if you're underneath the shade, you can't. And the plants, I mean, the volume that I produce. So like I'm not getting less plants because they're under 50%, or not, I'm not getting less flowers because they're under 50%
No, I mean, they
shade.
look like they are so happy. And I think just mitigating the stress that was the
Yeah.
temperatures and the sun was creating, even though it may get less sunlight than it likes, I think the lack of stress, it sort of balances the equation.
They
And
stretch a little. I think they stretch a little bit under the shade too, but not in an unhealthy way, like as if they're
not
too
leggy.
shaded.
Yeah. Yeah.
No. And so yeah, so 50, I have 50% of my tunnel too. I don't think 30% would do it.
Well, if they can grow tomatoes in 50%, you can
Yeah,
grow dahlias in 50%. I mean, they're different plants, but tomatoes usually thrive in full sun. So
right.
I can imagine that that's not really a big
And
issue there.
if I want more sun, I can just pull, like it drapes over the ends, the shade cloth does. I can pull that up, and then the west sun gets in there if I wanted to. I never do. If I'm out there, I want the shade on me too. So, um,
Of
yeah, so it's worked
course.
out really well. I'm glad that my husband agreed to make that investment in it. It was it wasn't really hard to convince him because he could see what was happening. So,
Well, it was
but
a deal. It was a
those
game
are
changer.
yeah, it was. And I would not have had a successful crop last year if it hadn't, I mean, minus corn borer and minus wireworm, whatever, but I wouldn't have had a successful crop without having had that in place. And not a lot of people are growing under shade, but I get a lot of people asking me questions about it, contacting me through Instagram, asking about the structures themselves and how, like, kind of what the specs are on them. And I'm happy to share that. So, um, you know,
Okay.
if people can benefit from my experience, that's great.
Awesome. Well, one of the things you mentioned a second ago that I want to touch on, because I think, again, it's another counterintuitive thing you do that works well. I asked you when you first started showing me flowers and things, I'm like, so how many dinner plates are you growing? And the only one you really grew was cafe au lait. I think you might have grown one other one, but it really wasn't anything, whatever. But and then you told me, you kind of tended to gravitate towards a little bit more modest sized flower that produced more. And it was like, okay, it makes perfect sense. But I kind of wanted you to maybe, do you mind sharing about that a little bit? Because I feel like, everybody wants the big dinner plate dahlias, and everybody wants, the showy things that, sometimes don't produce as many numbers, don't have a good shelf life, are insect magnet. I mean, all these things, and you really opened my eyes into some of that, and I really thought, I want people to hear that message,
Yeah.
because I feel like if you're trying to make money growing dahlias, these are things that you really need to consider.
Yeah, I mean, bigger isn't always better. So like that, we're not talking stem length, we're talking like flower size. And
Right.
the bigger the flower, the the fewer days you will have it in a vase. The dinner plates really are not long lasting. And I mean, in looking at all the potential varieties that are available, I gravitated towards color and shape that would work in bouquets, and work in centerpieces. And so picked accordingly. The smaller ones happen to be, well, depending on variety, happen to be more productive. It's always depending on variety, but this the minis are great for certain work, corsage, boutonniere, the flower crowns and those types of things. So they have their place. And they're mini, but they're cool if you're growing the right colors, um, and they're very productive. It's the same amount of labor to harvest them, but they're very productive. They're small and they're constantly pumping out blooms. And then you go into the balls, and like the smaller, like formal decoratives, and they're a lot more productive. They're smaller. They're they're not having to put all of this energy into producing this giant flower. And so that definitely, I'm looking, like, when I evaluate a new dahlia that comes to the farm, there are certain things that I look for. One is, the first thing now is it heat tolerant? Because if it's not, it's going. Then it's color and form, and what's its vase life? And so the longer the vase life, the better the color for like these palettes that I'm looking at, the more likely I am to keep it. But I do want to know volume, like how many stems am I getting off this plant weekly? So that helps me look at like numbers in terms of like what are my sales going to be, or what could they potentially be if I have dinner plate galore and they're only producing one stem per plant per week. Like, that's not gonna pay my rent. So
So what do you look
productivity
for?
productivity is like super important. So
But like, what do you look for when it comes to like a good stem count?
Um, so I'm looking for per week. I'm probably looking for per plant, 4 to 5 stems per plant. Some are more productive, some are less productive, but I will keep them because of color, because there are no other dahlias that are in that color range, or they're very coveted colors that are unusual.
But
So
compare
like
that. I'm kind of curious. Sorry to interrupt. I'm kind of curious when you compare that to like a cafe au lait. How many stems do you cut on that per week?
probably 2.
Okay, so that's the thing that like you just got done saying, plants. Now those plants tend to be a little bigger, but the point is that it takes just as much to cut those as others, and yes, you can get more money for the cafe au laits, but when you're getting 2 to 3 times the stem count per week, you
Well, and there's you always go back to the cafe au laits. They are coveted for their color and for specific purposes, and but they're not long lasting. They are event flowers,
right.
and you if you're going to grow them, then you need to know that like they're event flowers. They are harvested at a certain stage, and they're going to last for. They're not going to last a week. They're going to last for the event, and then maybe a day or two after, but then after that they're done. I've tested them all. So, but that's one I grow specifically because of the fact that it's a requested dahlia, and it's taken me a long time to try to get to the point of where I feel like I'm growing them well now, and I have a steady supply. But you know they are challenging, they are a pain, and they are not as productive as some of the other ones that I grow that I enjoy cutting, because I don't enjoy cutting cafe au lait either. You're always like watching that flower head, and
Yeah.
just because they produce less. And the color isn't stable. So you got the lights, the creamy color, you got the pinks, and then you got like a deeper pink, and depending on temperature they can change. So they're not very what's the word, stable. So
Well, yeah.
stability is another thing I look for in a dahlia. I don't want a plant that's going to produce like all these wild, like different variations. Like I want something that is very standardized, because I feel like a designer will want something that is consistent when they're putting together a whole event. The consistency across their work is important, because everything is tied back together. So
Right. No, I agree. Like peaches and cream is one I think about because I, over the years, have brought those in from 3 or 4 different places, and each one can be different.
mhm.
And that's one thing about yours when they come in. I mean, it's almost like they're like little clones of each other, which it's just refreshing to have something reliable like that. So, well, I'm glad to hear that because I feel like a lot of times people will pick varieties of dahlias because they're their favorites. It's their colors. They think, oh, I can get more money for dinner plates. But that's not necessarily where you probably should put all your eggs in that basket, so to speak, because you might make more money finding varieties that definitely produce more flowers. And I think that's
Yeah.
kind of a big deal.
Yeah, I mean, if you're going to grow a dinner plate, if you're growing commercially and you're going to grow a dinner plate, you need to know why you're growing it. Like,
Hmm.
what do you want out of that?
That's a good point.
If you're a hobbyist, grow all the dinner plates, go to the shows, show them off. And that's a whole different game. And I love seeing people who are so enthusiastic about that and producing all these giant flowers, but that's not why I'm growing. So I mean, that's part of like figuring out why you want to grow. Do you want to be a hobbyist, or do you want to be a cut flower producer, a dahlia producer? And if you do, then you definitely need to have that mindset of like, these are the varieties that are going to be productive. I have a purpose for growing them. I know about how many stems I'm going to get per plant per week. I know what I can charge for these, and I know they're going to be consistent
Yeah.
in
Well,
color.
I think that's really interesting. One of the things I've noticed you talking about lately, because I know you're trialing new varieties, like to see how they do the situation, is dealing with viruses. Which
Yeah.
this is one of those things I know. It's a very frustrating thing, and I know I feel like because I know in past years I've grown lots of tomatoes, and I've seen things that I'm like, okay, and it just drives me crazy. You get a plant to that stage where they're just about ready to do something, and I end up ripping it out of the ground, or because I maybe I didn't catch it. But excuse me. But I'm curious if you have any thoughts on this, like ways to prevent it, or what to look for, just things to help people. Because I this is one of those areas I feel like being proactive is real. What is it? Defense is the best offense when it comes to viruses, and I'm just kind of curious, what you
Yeah,
think
it's
about
a
it.
hot topic in the dahlia world right now. There are some, it's a difficult issue any way you look at it because, virus can show at any point, but particularly when plants are under stress. If we think about like the temperature now outside, and a lot of plants are just starting to get going. If they're stressed because of heat, they start showing symptoms of virus. But it is pervasive in the dahlia trade at this point. There, I would argue that there's probably not a farm in the US that doesn't have virus on it. That is how pervasive it is. There was a study done in Washington through the Dahlia Society, and these are very good growers who submitted plant samples, and it turns out like I think 75%. That percentage, it was extremely high. 70 to 75% were virus, and there are multiple viruses that show different symptomology. So if these are knowledgeable, experienced growers with virus, then that has to be that's a snapshot of what the US dahlia community looks like at this point. And I'm a part of the Facebook group, the dahlia Facebook groups, and I see it all the time, looking at leaves and like yellowing veins and certain patterns on the leaves. And you know it's a tough thing to tackle, because if it's that pervasive, then how do we just accept it and retain the healthiest of those plants, and that is just the way it's going to be moving forward? Or do we say we're going to pull all the plants that have virus, knowing that if the virus can be transmitted from other plants, that there's a chance that they're going to get virus anyway? I don't know.
So
I've pulled a lot of plants this year. Every single diva plant was pulled. 60. So I have a whole row of purple. 60 of the row were diva, and there were the veins, the leaf veins, and there was patterning. So it may have been two viruses, but they all went, and I just replanted something in its place. But then I'm like, okay, I'm pulling plants from other areas. I'm pulling plants from the new ones that came into me. Like, how do we deal with this going forward? And I do not know what the answer is. Do we accept it, or we don't accept it and pull them? So I don't know. I think I saw a grower yesterday post that she had a friend come over, and they pulled like 75% of her plants. And if you are depending on making your living on growing those and selling those, you've just put yourself out of business. you know so
yeah,
I
for at least the
it's a
year.
tough call. It's a tough call for commercial growers for sure. um
So how does
you
the
know
virus impact the bloom? Because I know that if you are in like that, for example, like I could see where if you're pulling 75% of your crop out, is it worth letting it run its course because and then just trying to start completely from scratch the next year. Um, and I
I
don't
think,
know that, yeah, go.
yeah, I mean, I think starting from scratch, you would have to have tissue culture from certified virus-free plants. Um, and then you would have to spray. You would have to use systemic insecticides in order to have protection from any insect that's going to come and bite that plant. So I know a lot of growers are using systemics to prevent that. And it's the only way to prevent it. If you're, and I am very pro organic growing. I try to be as chemical free as possible. But bagging blooms protects that from Japanese beetles. Great. But it's not going to prevent it from an insect like a leaf hopper hopping from one plant to another and biting the leaves, because they have the capability of transferring virus, as well as somebody who is not cleaning their snips in between every single plant.
Exactly.
So, you know,
So I'm glad you said that because so you've got insects that are vectors or whatever you call them that go from plant to plant. They bite, like you said, the infected plant, go to a new one and infect it for you. But cutting tools, clippers and scissors and things like that. I know, in the rose world, people are very aware of that because of transmitting different things. Um, and I'm glad you said that because with dahlias, it's the same thing. You can transmit it just as easily that way.
yeah, even when you pinch the growing tips, I used to do it with my thumbnail, and I'd have like the ugliest, greenest brown thumbnail ever. And I was like, I earned that. Now I don't do that. I snap the tip off because I don't want any of that plant residue underneath my fingernail. In that it can transfer. I think that can transfer virus from one plant to another, especially when they're young and you're snapping off that little meristem, where all the growth, that's the growth point for it. So,
Right. Yeah, it's very active. So to infect that point is only going to expedite the situation.
well, and the same for like dividing. When you dig and you divide, you nick a tuber with a shovel, and then you use that same shovel and you nick another tuber. Is that transferring virus? When you're dividing, are you cleaning your snips in between every single one, every single tuber clump? So that can be,
Yeah.
that's the same with gall as well. So crown gall and leafy gall, which is, I think, that is prevalent in a lot of the imported plant material, more so, I think, than virus. At least in my experience, that is the case. So
Mm.
like it's, the imports coming in with crown and leafy gall versus like potentially buying in tubers that have virus, which seems to be prevalent in the US. So it's like a pick your poison kind of a thing. But
Well,
it's a problem, and we need researchers who are who can solve the problem. Like, is there a vaccine for tomato spot wilt virus? I don't know, but maybe there is. But
yeah.
we do need more horticultural research to to figure out ways to combat it, if not
Yeah.
prevent it or cure it. But I just don't know that there's government money earmarked for that kind of thing.
Right.
Um,
Well, you mentioned pinching, and I wanted to get into a couple basic things real quick. What stage do you pinch your dahlias?
Usually three to four leaf sets. The
Okay.
cafes get pinched at three. Everything else can be three or four. You pinch, it gives, so in pinching, when they're young, first of all, or sorry, snapping, um, it closes out that top stem. So the plant kind of heals. But in pinching when they're little, then you have a lower center of gravity on the plant, and they're a lot more stable than if you wait. And it also makes them a lot more productive. And you get
Sure.
that lateral branching.
Sure. Yeah, you go from having one or two canes to having many canes, so or
Well, and if you
crowns.
don't pinch, you get the broomstick.
Ah,
You get that like softball bat. of like a stem that's like that big, and like you can't put that in a bridal bouquet. It would be like it would be like the bride would have to have like meat cleaver hands in order to like carry it down the aisle. Like, yeah.
Yeah,
So like
yeah, because it's
in
kind of
terms
like
of like, yeah.
they're carrying it. She's carrying it down the aisle, and you're just like, "Where's the bride?" Because you can't see her behind the
Behind the tree trunk.
yeah, behind this gigantic flower and stem. Okay, so let me ask this question: fertilizing. What do you do for fertilizer?
So here's what I do certain things. It's all based on soil tests. So
Which is a good point.
I worked with the accidental agronomist um, in reading the soil tests because I, I mean, I looked at it and I was horrified. I'm like, we have like the worst soil ever. And she was like, okay, I'm going to calm you right down because we're looking at the graphs that they send you with the red, and it's like, I can't grow anything here. She's like, that's like very exaggerated. So a soil test and having somebody knowledgeable interpret it for you can talk you off the ledge, and also having that person be able to recommend to you what amendments you need to add. And I think that is very very specific to the farm, because even on our farm I had 6 different areas tested and they all came back different. Some very different than others in terms of pH and what the soil was lacking. So I think get a soil test and then find someone who can help you with that. I think that like extension agencies can help you. Your NRCS officer, if they can't help you, they can recommend somebody who can. But you find people who are very knowledgeable about that and listen to them. And for me, we are very low on calcium and sulfur here, like really low. That was like the biggest red zone was that. And so, you know, for the past 18 months, I've been adding copious amounts of gypsum because our pH is fine, but I
Hmm.
need the calcium, and gypsum has both calcium and sulfur in it, and it does not affect the pH. Like everybody told me to lime. They were like, oh, you're moving to, central Tennessee, you need to add lime. You gotta lime that soil because it's what everybody does. You see the lime trucks and there's like white dust in the air everywhere. I'm like, we need to lime. And before I had gotten the soil test back, I had my husband like searching for someone who could come lime the soil because everybody was like, you need lime. And we didn't need lime.
Hmm.
So
That's a good
the
point.
farmer down the road's needs on that soil are very different from the needs here. Maybe he needs to get a soil test. I don't know. He
Well,
could
the
just be
thing,
listening to everybody else saying, you need lime. I don't know.
well, it's a great point though that often um, areas are. It depends on what you're growing, and it depends on you can be what a quarter of a mile apart and have completely different soil.
Mm-hmm.
You can probably actually be more like 300 yards apart and still have completely different soil. On your
Yeah, yeah. And that
property,
was,
you have,
I mean, that was
yeah.
remarkable to me because you think like, here's the farm, like, here's like 2 acres, 3 acres. You think it's gonna all be the same, and it's not. And that's crazy. And there were significant differences in like the back areas compared to the front area where the shrubs are. And I was like, that to me, that just it was an eye opener. Because you can't treat all the soil on your farm the same way. Especially if you're growing crops that need certain things, like cut flowers need that they definitely do well with a boost of calcium. So for stem strength, um, I think it's one reason why some of my ranunculus were so tall. But the dahlias they do need that support. They also need nitrogen. I know there's a lot of people who think that dahlias don't need nitrogen because if you add nitrogen, they're going to just be leaves. You're not going to get flowers. And you do need nitrogen for that continual growth. I will supplement like kind of mid-season. So I'll apply my fertilizers before planting, let that sit for probably a week or two, and then plant because I don't want the tubers sending out roots that might burn. But the fertilizers are based on the soil tests. But with the knowledge that I need nitrogen, I
Mm.
will use several different types of nitrogen in order to get that release over the course of the season. So, I am so while we do spray for insects, we don't use herbicides, and I'm very concerned about the type of fertilizers that I'm using. I'd like them to be organic. I like to use more natural things when I can. And so I use a combination of different types of meals: alfalfa meal, feather meal, and peanut meal, which gives a release of nitrogen over the course of the season, because some
Quicker than
are
others.
more available right away, and then so it just staggers it, but you can put it all down at the same time.
That's a great idea. One of the things, and I mean, I feel like I know that we're about out of time, but at the same time, I know we could talk, you and I especially could talk for hours. But one of the things you did this year, which I wish more people did, is stagger your planting.
Oh yeah.
Because we think about succession planting with zinnias and celosia and sunflower, all these different crops, and even though dahlias just keep producing and producing and producing, they still have, like roses, kind of have waves. And I think by doing that, I think that was I was really excited to hear you were doing that. And I'm curious if you might can enlighten some other people, like why, how, and the thought behind it.
So yeah, so for me, I didn't want everything blooming all at the same time. It's a little bit sorry. Um, sorry.
So it's
You
okay.
you asked if I had good dogs that were gonna bark, and there they are.
It's
Um,
okay. It's okay.
so
So if you would start with, for me, because that's when they started. So
yeah, so I decided to stagger the blooms so I would have a fresh crop or fresh set of blooms, like as the season progressed. If I planted all of my blizzard at the same time, like the plants start to look a little tired by the end of the season, and I wanted to make sure that I had fresh blooms at the end of the season. And so I planted a month apart on certain crops, and so I ended up with 4 waves of planting,
mm,
which will give some rest time to some of the plants as they put on growth, and then the next set
wave.
would be
Yeah.
coming into bloom. But I knew I needed white, through the growing season. I knew I needed peach through the growing season and cafe au lait through the growing season. So I thought about that when I staggered like 3 plantings of those. Um, the burgundy was a mistake to have it planted all at the same time, but whatever. I won't do that next year. Um,
So so let me get this straight. You said a month apart. So when was the first planting, and then when was the last planting?
so the first planting was the second week of April.
Okay.
And then I was looking at like the second and third week of May, and then I was looking at the second, third week of June. So that was pretty much it. And honestly, I just pulled a bunch of plants today, and I'm gonna go out tomorrow and put tubers in. It's like a Hail Mary. Maybe I'll get, maybe I'll get a flower off it. Maybe I won't. I don't think it's too late. So they need to be in the ground 120 days for the tubers to be like cured, for you to be able to overwinter them. And so yeah, so for me, it made sense to stagger the planting, to have fresh blooms. There's a very, and I knew this from PA. Like I had 2 plantings because I had extra Rockburn Ashley, and the one, so I had a little bit of space left, and I put in a second planting like a month after. And the first planting of Rockburn Ashley just looked tired. The stems were thinner, the flowers weren't as robust. And then that second planting, when they started blooming and seeing them kind of side by side. They were close enough where you could really tell the difference. It was pretty remarkable. And I think we forget as the season progresses, because we go out and we see them every day, but to see that contrast like in front of me helped me realize like you need to do this for your business so that you have like that superior bloom um, through the whole growing season. And because I want to get to the market early, that was my way of being able to maintain a consistent quality bloom.
I really love that. Well, I always like to end with that advice question. And I don't know, I'm not gonna, I'm putting you on the spot here. Maybe we'll be able to do maybe an Instagram live or something at your place or something just
That'd be fun. Then
later
everybody can see
on.
the field.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that might be, and I think it'll be good. So if we'll figure that out later, but, I'm just curious if there's anything that you'd like to leave with our listeners or anything that someone has shared with you that's really meant a lot.
So a couple of things. I've been thinking about this. Like there were people who believed that I couldn't grow dahlias here, that they, that I couldn't do it because of the heat. And, I think you, within reason, you have to believe enough in yourself and your, you know, ingenuity in order to be able to make something happen. I believed I could do it, and I found ways to be able to grow here. Um, so, people might tell you can't do something. If you're determined and you're passionate, you'll figure out a way to do it. And then the other thing is, and I don't know if a lot of people know this or not, but I was an English teacher for a large part of my life. Um,
I didn't
that
know
was
that.
that was my big girl job, and then like the flowers are on the side kind of thing, for a long time. And I changed careers, the floret, like being in London and having the experience that I did and being submersed in the flower world while I was there, and then coming back and having the floret course, like enabled me to change careers. Did I know that I was going to do that? I did not know that. I thought that I would be an English teacher until I was old and gray like I am now. But you're not too old to change careers. If you're sitting there and you're thinking like, I don't think that I could, I was at the point where I could not do another day in the classroom. I just could not. And I had enough experience at that point growing, um, and doing that as like kind of like a side hustle, a passion that became a side hustle. I knew that I knew I could do it. I think you have to educate yourself. You have to be willing to have a few hard years of like practice, before you get it, you get into that groove and you really know what you're doing. Um, but it's not too late. You're never too old to have a career change, to find something that, you know, matches more with your value system and, you know, what's important to you. And I wanted to have a calmer life. I wanted to have more inner peace and emotional stability. And, flowers have really provided me with that. But, I was in my 40s when I started the flower thing. I'm 52 now, where this is my second full-time year. I'm half a century old. So, I mean, if I can do it, I'm old. You can do it.
Yeah, well, I'm gonna say you're not old because I'm older than you, so you're not old. But what I will say is, I think that your passion is what really drives a lot of your success, and you can see it. It's so funny. Sometimes we watch cooking shows, and they always talk about how they can feel the love in the food or the passion in the food, and if you're not into it, it comes out in your food, and I feel like it's the same way with flowers. I feel like if you're not really into it, then it's a reflection. It comes out. I mean, it's obvious in the flowers that you grow, and
Because
um,
I love them. I love them. I love my flowers. I love sharing the flowers. I love talking about flowers. I'm pretty introverted. But if you start me talking about flowers, like, like I just don't stop. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, if you have a passion for something, pursue it. That's your second, that could be your side hustle. That could be your next career. And it's led me to meet some pretty wonderful people. I'm really lucky to have the group of friends that I have, and have met the people that I have and been involved with the things that I've been involved with. And it's just, the flower industry is, it's so diverse, and there's so many things to do
Yes.
within it. That, I mean, if you love flowers, there's a place for you somewhere within that you can utilize your talents. So,
Yeah, I
and the
agree.
last thing I'll say is, my my husband has pointed out, like, I love flowers, I love what I do. I don't actually always come across that way in my videos, or like my reels and stuff on Instagram. I often look like I'm scowling. It's just my face. It's just the way my face looks. I'm like happy to be out there, if it doesn't translate this way, just listen to
That's
what I have to say.
funny.
Don't like actually look at this.
Well, when you're out in the sun and the hats and the rain and the water and the dogs and everything, it is what it is. But
We tried to do a photo shoot once, and like there's like 400 pictures, and there is not one picture where I'm like not scowling. So I'm like, most of the pictures don't feature me for that
well,
reason.
you know what? Your dahlias do all the smiling you need. So there you go. Thanks so much, Erica, for being on the Flower
Thank,
Podcast.
thank you for having me.